The frost clung to every surface inside the concrete bunker on the morning of January 8, 1945. General Major Werner Osenberg stood at a workbench in a requisitioned laboratory 20 kilometers south of Berlin, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. Before him lay an object that had been recovered 2 weeks earlier from the Ardennes forest, an American artillery shell, intact, unexploded. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The shell measured 5 inches in diameter, standard for American heavy artillery, but Osenberg wasn't interested in the explosive. His attention fixed on the nose assembly, where his technicians had carefully extracted what appeared to be a complete miniature radio transmitter housed inside a fuse roughly the size of a wine bottle. The device contained approximately 130 individual electronic components, each smaller than anything German industry produced for field equipment. Glass vacuum tubes no larger than a fingertip sat nestled in specialized cradles designed to absorb shock, a battery system activated by centrifugal force, radio circuitry calibrated to frequencies German radar detectors couldn't sense, safety mechanisms layered upon safety mechanisms, and all of it, every delicate component, had survived being fired from a gun at accelerations that should have pulverized it into dust. Osenberg had spent 3 years as head of the planning office of the Reich Research Council, coordinating Germany's scientific mobilization. He understood industrial capacity. He knew material science. He recognized sophisticated engineering when he saw it. What lay before him on that workbench represented something far more troubling than a clever weapon. It represented a comprehensive technological advantage that Germany had not merely failed to match. Germany had concluded it was impossible to achieve. The shell had been found near Malmö, Belgium, on December 23, 1944, 3 days after American artillery batteries began firing these new proximity-fused shells against German forces caught in the open during the Ardennes offensive. Wehrmacht soldiers called them Wundergranat wonder shells. Others used darker terms. The shells detonated in midair with perfect consistency, 20 to 50 feet above the ground, showering down steel fragments that turned foxholes into death traps and made defensive positions untenable. The psychological impact had been immediate and devastating. Units that had survived years of combat on the Eastern Front, men who had endured the worst that Soviet artillery could deliver, reported something they had never experienced before: helplessness. Traditional cover provided no protection. The shrapnel rained down from directly overhead. There was no warning, no chance to take shelter, no tactical adaptation that could reduce casualties. German commanders offered rewards for intact proximity fuses, hoping examination might reveal weaknesses or suggest countermeasures. This specimen, recovered by soldiers from the 15th Army after an American fire mission near Monschau, had been rushed through military intelligence channels with unusual urgency. Reich Marshal Hermann Göring had demanded immediate technical assessment. Admiral Karl Dönitz, recently promoted to Commander-in-Chief of the entire Kriegsmarine while maintaining operational control of U-boat forces, requested parallel evaluation by naval technical specialists. Both men understood that if the Americans could manufacture proximity fuses in quantity for artillery, the same technology could be almost certainly already had been adapted for anti-aircraft guns defending against the Luftwaffe and for depth charges hunting submarines. The examination began on January 2, 1945, at the Telefunken facility in Berlin. Germany's top electronics specialists gathered around the recovered shell, like surgeons preparing for a complex operation. Dr. Hans Rukop, Telefunken's chief engineer and one of Germany's leading experts in vacuum tube technology, supervised the disassembly. Every step was photographed, every component measured. The radio circuitry particularly interested the German team. It operated at frequencies between 180 and 220 MHz, using Doppler radar principles to detect proximity to targets. When reflected, radio waves reached a predetermined frequency shift, indicating the shell had approached within lethal range. An electrical circuit closed and detonated the explosive charge. The theory was straightforward. German scientists understood the physics perfectly. What they couldn't comprehend was the engineering. How had American manufacturers produced vacuum tubes capable of surviving 20,000 times the force of Earth's gravity during firing? Acceleration when a 5-inch shell left the gun barrel would crush conventional electronics instantly. The tubes inside this fuse showed no damage. They had functioned perfectly during the few seconds of flight time before the shell was supposed to detonate over its target. Rukop held one of the miniature tubes up to the laboratory light, examining the thickened glass envelope through a magnifying lens. The internal filaments and grids had been redesigned with shorter spans and heavier cross-sections than any hearing aid tube Germany produced. The glass itself appeared to be a specialized composition, carefully annealed to withstand thermal shock and mechanical stress. Every design choice prioritized ruggedness over efficiency. American engineers had solved the fundamental problem not through theoretical breakthrough, but through methodical, costly, iterative development. The battery system revealed another layer of sophisticated engineering. The fuse contained a reserve battery that kept its liquid electrolyte separated from the battery plates until activation. When the shell fired, centrifugal force spun the electrolyte into contact with the plates, generating electricity. This design gave the batteries indefinite shelf-life. Shells could sit in storage for months without degradation. The elegant simplicity of the solution made it more impressive. German engineers had experimented with similar concepts, but never achieved production reliability. Multiple safety mechanisms prevented premature detonation. The fuse couldn't arm until well clear of the gun. It required protection against accidental triggering from radio interference or electromagnetic emissions from the firing ship's own radar systems. It needed wave suppression circuitry to prevent detonation when fired at low angles over water. Each safety feature added complexity, yet the Americans had miniaturized all of this into a package 8 inches long, weighing just over 2 pounds. By January 5th, the initial technical report reached Gring's headquarters. The conclusions were stark and professionally phrased, but they couldn't disguise the underlying reality. The document, which would be recovered by Allied intelligence teams after the war, stated that American industry had achieved manufacturing capabilities that exceeded Germany's by what appeared to be 3 to 5 years of normal peacetime development. More critically, the report noted that even if Germany immediately devoted maximum resources to replicating the technology, production at meaningful scale would not begin before 1946 at the earliest. The industrial requirements alone seemed insurmountable. Peak American production had reached 40,000 proximity fuses per day, nearly 3 billion individual electronic components manufactured to precise specifications, assembled, tested, and shipped to combat theaters worldwide. This represented manufacturing capacity that dwarfed Germany's entire electronics industry output. The report estimated that over 100 American factories participated in some phase of proximity fuse production. The Crosley Corporation in Cincinnati alone employed 10,000 workers operating continuously, 7 days per week, achieving peak output of 16,500 fuses daily. Sylvania Electric Products manufactured the miniature vacuum tubes, 95% of all tubes used across the entire program, while also producing 5.6 million complete fuses. The German specialists understood what these numbers meant. This wasn't a secret weapon developed in a hidden laboratory. This was industrial warfare at a scale that made tactical skill and operational excellence increasingly irrelevant. If America could build miniature radios that fit inside artillery shells and worked after being subjected to forces that would destroy normal electronics, what else could they build? What other technologies had they perfected while German? Scientists concluded such achievements were theoretically impossible. General Major Osenberg composed a supplementary memorandum for the Reich Research Council on January 10th. His language remained technical, but the subtext was unmistakable. Germany had been operating under fundamentally flawed assumptions about Allied industrial capacity and technological sophistication. The proximity fuse demonstrated that American research programs operated with resources that exceeded anything available to German science. More troubling, it suggested that other surprises likely existed, weapons or systems that German intelligence hadn't detected, because German technical experts had dismissed them as impractical or impossible. The psychological dimension troubled Osenberg more than the technical reality. Wehrmacht commanders were already reporting discipline problems in units exposed to proximity-focused artillery fire. Soldiers refused orders to move into areas under American artillery coverage. NCOs described what intelligence officers termed artillery shock syndrome, a condition specifically triggered by the helplessness of facing a weapon that provided no warning and offered no defense. The phenomenon was unprecedented. German forces had endured massive artillery barrages throughout the war. They had fought through fire missions that killed hundreds in minutes. But those attacks could be anticipated, prepared for, endured. The proximity fuses destroyed that calculus. Every shell was a perfect airburst. Every salvo turned defensive positions into killing zones. The random chance of survival that sustained morale during conventional bombardments simply didn't exist. Reports from the Ardennes provided statistical confirmation. During the defensive actions around Malmö on December 21st, American artillery battalions supporting the town fired proximity-focused shells with devastating effect. The airbursts so unnerved attacking SS forces that some soldiers charged directly into American positions seeking any shelter from the overhead explosions. German casualties from artillery during the Ardennes offensive ran significantly higher than normal rates, with medical personnel reporting that wounds from proximity-focused shells tended to be more severe than wounds from conventional artillery. The shrapnel came from above, targeting heads and shoulders. Multiple fragment wounds were common. Lethality rates climbed. Lieutenant General Georg von Küchler, commanding defensive operations in the northern sector of the Ardennes salient, filed a battlefield assessment on January 4th that reached Hitler's headquarters within 24 hours. He reported that American artillery effectiveness had increased by what he estimated as a factor of 3 to 5 times previous capability. Traditional counter-battery fire couldn't suppress the threat because American guns now operated with near-perfect lethality at any range where they could reach German positions. Maneuver warfare became extraordinarily difficult when movement invited artillery strikes that killed with mechanical efficiency. Von Küchler's conclusion was professionally worded but strategically devastating. Unless Germany could develop effective countermeasures or achieve air superiority that suppressed American artillery observation, defensive operations would become progressively more costly until they became unsustainable. The examination of the proximity fuse continued through mid-January, as additional specialists joined the assessment. Engineers from Rheinmetall-Borsig, Germany's leading artillery and armaments manufacturer, brought expertise in fuse design. They arrived knowing that their own company had worked on proximity fuse development throughout the 1930s. The program, designated Kuhglock for 88mm shells, had been based on electrostatic principles rather than radio transmission. German researchers had concluded by late 1939 that while the concept worked in laboratory conditions, making it survive the violence of artillery fire would require miniaturization and reliability that exceeded available technology. In 1940, Hitler's directive prioritizing only projects that could reach production within 6 months to support Operation Barbarossa had terminated the program. Work resumed briefly in early 1944, when battlefield reports from both Eastern and Western fronts indicated Allied technological advantages in multiple domains. By then, it was far too late. Rheinmetall's engineers examined the American fuse with professional appreciation mixed with resignation. Initial testing of their own electrostatic design in 1944 had demonstrated a sensitivity of 1 to 2 meters and reliability around 80% when fired against metal cable targets. Circuit adjustments improved this to 3 to 4 meters with 95% reliability. Further, development achieved 10 to 15 meter sensitivity. The design was technically mature and ready for production, but production never began because Allied bombing had disrupted German electronics manufacturing. Material shortages made components increasingly scarce, and the Rheinmetall-Borsig facilities at Milhausen were overrun by advancing American forces before series production could commence. Several hundred working prototypes existed. Approximately 1,000 test rounds had been successfully fired. None entered combat service. The comparison to American production 22 million proximity fuses, manufactured at costs that dropped from $732 per unit in 1942 to $18 by 1945, as mass production efficiencies took effect, revealed the decisive advantage of industrial capacity. Germany had developed comparable theoretical understanding. German scientists had designed functional prototypes. What Germany lacked was the manufacturing infrastructure, the supply chain coordination, the trained workforce, and the material resources to translate prototypes into weapons produced by the millions. This wasn't a failure of German engineering or German science. It was the inevitable outcome of attempting industrial warfare against an enemy whose productive capacity exceeded Germany's by an order of magnitude. The realization spread through German military and technical leadership during January 1945 like a slow-moving collapse of confidence. Officers who had maintained faith in German technical superiority, who believed that superior training and tactical skill could offset material disadvantages, confronted physical evidence that the gap had become unbridgeable. The proximity fuse wasn't magic. It was applied science supported by unlimited industrial resources. If America could afford to spend over $1 billion 1940s dollars on a single weapon system more than MA said, Germany's entire military research budget while simultaneously developing atomic weapons, building the world's largest navy, supporting strategic bombing campaigns, and supplying Allied armies worldwide, then Germany was fighting an opponent whose economic power made victory mathematically impossible. General Feldmarschall Wilhelm Keitel, chief of the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, received briefings on the proximity fuse examination during the second week of January. His response, recorded in staff meeting notes later captured by Soviet forces, reflected both professional military assessment and personal bitterness. He noted that Germany had entered the war, assuming that early victories would provide the resources and industrial capacity needed to sustain a longer conflict. That assumption had proven catastrophically wrong. The enemies Germany faced in late 1944, particularly the United States, possessed industrial ecosystems that could absorb losses, replace equipment, and introduce technological improvements at rates that made German advantages temporary at best. The proximity fuse represented not a specific tactical threat, though it certainly was that, but rather a symbol of comprehensive material superiority. Intelligence assessments compiled from interrogations of American prisoners of war during late 1944 and early 1945 added context to the technical findings. American soldiers described production facilities operating at scales German officers found difficult to credit. Shipyards launching Liberty ships at rates of 1.5 vessels daily, aircraft factories producing bombers and fighters by the thousands per month, tank plants turning out Sherman tanks faster than German forces could destroy them, artillery pieces manufactured in such quantities that ammunition supply, not gun availability, became the limiting factor in fire missions. And underlying all of this, an electronics industry that could devote massive resources to proximity fuse production, while simultaneously supporting radar systems, radio communications, and fire control computers. The Americans called it the arsenal of democracy. German commanders understood it as the economic reality that made continued resistance increasingly futile, but understanding military impossibility and accepting political defeat were different matters. The war continued not because Germany could win, but because the alternative was unconditional surrender and occupation by enemies who had suffered years of German aggression. For the scientists and engineers examining the proximity fuse in that cold Berlin laboratory, the technical assessment reached an inescapable conclusion. Germany had not been defeated by a secret wonder weapon or revolutionary battlefield innovation. Germany had been defeated by an opponent who could manufacture sophisticated technology by the millions, distribute it globally, and maintain supply chains that ensured every front received whatever equipment military necessity demanded. The proximity fuse was merely one example among many radar systems, computing machines, advanced aircraft, nuclear weapons development, where Allied technological and industrial advantages had become decisive. Osenberg's final report, submitted to the Reich Research Council on January 20, 1945, stated in carefully chosen language that Germany's scientific and engineering communities had achieved remarkable results given severe resource constraints. German researchers had made significant contributions to multiple fields. German innovation in rocketry, jet propulsion, and other advanced technologies demonstrated continued excellence. But excellence without industrial capacity to support mass production meant that German advances remained limited to prototypes and small-scale deployment, while Allied advantages became battlefield realities that changed the strategic balance. The document concluded with a recommendation that probably surprised no one who read it. Germany should prioritize weapons that could be produced quickly using available materials and existing manufacturing infrastructure, rather than pursuing advanced technologies that required resources Germany no longer possessed. It was advice born of necessity and realism. By late January 1945, German industrial production had collapsed to fraction of previous levels. Strategic bombing had destroyed major manufacturing centers. Raw material shortages limited even basic production. The transportation network was failing under continuous air attack. Fuel shortages grounded aircraft and restricted armored operations. The German military was cannibalizing its own equipment to keep diminishing forces operational. In this context, discovering that the Americans had perfected proximity fuses 3 years earlier and produced them by the tens of millions simply confirmed what the broader strategic situation already demonstrated. Germany was fighting enemies whose combined industrial power exceeded anything a single European nation could match, regardless of tactical skill, operational excellence, or ideological commitment. The examination of the proximity fuse ended officially on January 25, 1945. The device was catalogued, photographed extensively, and sent to storage alongside other captured Allied equipment being preserved for post-war analysis, assuming Germany survived in any form that would conduct such analysis. The technical specialists returned to more immediate problems: keeping existing weapons systems operational, developing countermeasures for Allied technologies that were actually being encountered in combat, salvaging what remained of German industrial capacity. But for those who had participated in the examination, the knowledge remained. They had held in their hands proof of America's comprehensive technological superiority. They had seen miniaturized electronics that German manufacturers couldn't replicate. They had calculated production numbers that made German output look primitive by comparison. They understood, with the clarity that comes from direct technical assessment, that Germany had been fighting the Second World War with peacetime industrial capacity against opponents who had reorganized their entire economies for total war production at scales that defied traditional military planning. Assumptions. The psychological weight of this understanding would follow many of them through the remaining months of the war and into the uncertain future that waited beyond Germany's inevitable defeat. They had witnessed not merely a clever weapon, but the physical manifestation of industrial might that transformed scientific theory into mass-produced reality. The proximity fuse had shown them exactly how far Germany had fallen behind and how impossible it would be to ever close that gap, while the war continued to consume Germany's diminishing resources. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The winter of 1945 brought Germany face to face with technological realities that shattered carefully maintained illusions about industrial parity. The proximity fuse examination had opened a window into American manufacturing capabilities that German military leadership found increasingly difficult to reconcile with their previous understanding of the war's strategic balance. General Lieutenant Walter Dornberger, who had overseen Germany's V-2 rocket program at Peenemünde and understood advanced weapons development as well as any officer in the Wehrmacht, received a detailed briefing on the proximity fuse findings in late January. His reaction, recorded in notes that would later surface during Operation Paperclip interrogations, revealed the depth of German miscalculation. Dornberger noted that Germany had invested enormous resources into developing ballistic missiles. The V-2 program alone consumed an estimated 2 billion Reichsmarks and employed tens of thousands of workers, including slave laborers from concentration camps. The result was a weapon that terrorized civilian populations but changed nothing strategically. Meanwhile, the Americans had spent a comparable sum developing a proximity fuse that multiplied the effectiveness of conventional artillery by factors of 3 to 5, transformed anti-aircraft defense against both manned aircraft and flying bombs, and could be produced in quantities that ensured every artillery, battery, and naval vessel received adequate supplies. The difference, Dornberger concluded, wasn't German scientific inferiority. German rocket scientists had achieved remarkable advances. The V-2 represented a technological milestone that would influence post-war missile development for decades. But Germany had pursued technological sophistication for its own sake, developing weapons that impressed through their innovation rather than their battlefield utility. America had pursued technological solutions to specific military problems, then manufactured those solutions at industrial scales that made them strategically decisive. One approach produced prestige weapons that generated propaganda value. The other approach produced war-winning capabilities that changed the fundamental calculus of combat. This philosophical difference reflected deeper disparities in how the two nations approached industrial warfare. Germany's military tradition emphasized operational excellence, superior tactics, better training, innovative doctrine. These advantages had carried the Wehrmacht through early victories when German forces fought enemies who were poorly prepared or inadequately equipped. But as the war progressed, and Germany faced opponents who could absorb initial defeats, replace destroyed units, and introduce successive waves of new equipment, operational excellence became insufficient. The materiel balance tilted decisively against Germany, and no amount of tactical skill could offset the reality that American factories were producing proximity fuses by the tens of thousands daily, while German industry struggled to maintain basic ammunition production. The interrogations of German prisoners of war captured during the Ardennes offensive and subsequent operations provided Allied intelligence officers with valuable insights into German psychology during this period. Major Robert Staver, chief of the Rocket Weapons Section in the Research and Intelligence Division of the United States Army Ordnance Corps, conducted extensive interrogations of captured German technical specialists throughout early 1945. His reports, declassified decades later, documented a consistent pattern. German engineers and scientists acknowledged that American proximity fuses demonstrated sophisticated miniaturization and reliable mass production. Many expressed professional admiration for the engineering solutions, but almost all described a deeper psychological impact, the realization that Germany had been fighting an opponent whose industrial capacity operated at scales that made German efforts seem almost artisanal by comparison. One artillery officer, captured near the Sauer River in late January, described to his interrogators the moment he examined an unexploded proximity-fused shell. He had commanded a battery of 88mm guns throughout the war, first in North Africa, then in Italy, finally in the desperate defense of the Reich itself. He understood artillery. He knew fuses. When he looked at the American device, he saw not just a clever piece of engineering, but what he called the death of German artillery doctrine. Traditional counter-battery tactics assumed that enemy guns firing time-fused shells needed visual, observation, or forward observers to adjust fire for maximum effectiveness. This gave defending forces opportunities to exploit weather, terrain, and tactical movement to reduce casualties. Proximity fuzzes eliminated those opportunities. Every shell became an optimal airburst, regardless of observation quality. Artillery that had been dangerous became absolutely lethal. The officer's assessment concluded with an observation that American interrogators found particularly significant. He stated that the proximity fuse finally made him comprehend that Germany had lost the war not at Stalingrad, not at Kursk, not even during the Normandy invasion, But years earlier, when Germany chose to fight enemies whose combined industrial output exceeded German capacity by margins too large to overcome through military skill, the proximity fuse was simply the physical manifestation of that industrial disparity. If America could afford to make artillery shells more sophisticated than most German radar systems, while producing those shells by the millions, then Germany never had any realistic chance of victory once the United States entered the war. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. These interrogation reports circulated through Allied intelligence channels and eventually reached senior American commanders. General Dwight Eisenhower, reviewing summaries in early February 1945, wrote to General George Marshall, noting that proximity fuses had achieved effects beyond their tactical utility. They had broken German confidence in technical superiority and demonstrated to Wehrmacht soldiers that they faced an enemy with resources that could not be matched. Eisenhower credited the fuses with contributing to the collapse of German resistance during the final months of the war, not merely through their battlefield effectiveness, but through their psychological impact on German morale. General George Patton, whose Third Army had used proximity fuses extensively during operations following the Battle of the Bulge, offered a more direct assessment. In a letter to the War Department dated late December 1944, Patton described an engagement near the Sauer River, where his artillery had caught a German battalion attempting to cross with a concentrated barrage of proximity-fused shells. By actual count, 702 enemy soldiers were killed. Patton wrote that the new shell with the funny fuse is devastating, and predicted that when all armies possessed this weapon, they would need to devise entirely new methods of warfare. He concluded with evident satisfaction, "I am glad that you all thought of it first." The broader strategic implications extended beyond artillery to anti-aircraft defense and naval warfare. German Luftwaffe pilots reported during interrogations that American anti-aircraft fire had become extraordinarily effective during late 1944 and early 1945. Shells seemed to explode whenever aircraft approached, regardless of altitude or evasive maneuvering. What had been dangerous but survivable flak became a nearly impossible barrier. Pilots described feeling hunted by weapons that could anticipate their movements and detonate at optimal range without requiring direct hits. The statistics confirmed their impressions. From January through March 1945, as Allied forces advanced toward the Rhine and into Germany itself, proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire brought down more than 1,000 German aircraft. The loss rate made daylight operations prohibitively expensive and forced the Luftwaffe to limit flights to circumstances where air superiority was absolutely essential. This further constrained German tactical options and accelerated the collapse of coordinated defense. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commanding the Kriegsmarine while continuing to oversee U-boat operations, received parallel briefings on proximity fuse implications for naval warfare. His staff had already analysed how similar technology adapted for depth charges and naval artillery would affect submarine operations. The conclusions mirrored the grim assessments from artillery specialists. If proximity fuses could detect U-boats with the same effectiveness they demonstrated against aircraft and ground targets, submarine warfare would become unsustainable. Boats would be unable to surface safely to recharge batteries or transit at high speed. The vast expanses of the ocean that had provided concealment would offer no protection against weapons that could detect metal hulls from significant distances and detonate at optimal depth automatically. Dönitz had already experienced a related technological defeat. The examination of the British cavity magnetron, recovered from a downed Sterling bomber near Rotterdam in February 1943, had revealed that Allied centimetric radar operated at frequencies German detection equipment couldn't sense. This had explained the catastrophic U-boat losses during 1943 and forced the withdrawal of submarines from the North Atlantic in May of that year. The proximity fuse represented another technology that rendered German countermeasures obsolete before they could be developed and deployed. The pattern was clear. German technical intelligence consistently underestimated Allied capabilities, assuming that technologies German scientists deemed impractical must also be impossible for Britain or America to achieve. This systematic underestimation reflected a broader cultural blindness. German military tradition emphasized quality over quantity, superior individual weapons, better trained soldiers, more sophisticated tactics. This approach had served Prussia well in 19th century conflicts, where wars were decided by relatively small professional armies fighting limited campaigns. But 20th century, industrial warfare rewarded mass production, logistical efficiency, and the ability to replace losses faster than enemies could inflict them. Germany entered World War II with peacetime industrial organization slightly expanded for military production. The United States reorganized its entire economy for total war, achieving output levels that made German production look insignificant by comparison. The numbers told the story with mathematical precision. In 1943, American factories produced approximately 85,000 aircraft. Germany produced approximately 25,000. American shipyards launched approximately 19 million tons of merchant shipping. Germany managed approximately 1 million tons. American industry manufactured proximity fuses at rates exceeding 40,000 per day at peak production. Germany never achieved series production of comparable devices. These disparities weren't the result of German technical incompetence. They reflected the reality that America possessed an industrial base roughly 10 times larger than Germany's in peacetime, which expanded dramatically during the war years, while German industry faced strategic bombing, raw material shortages, and labor shortages that reduced output even as demand increased. German military leadership had understood intellectually that America possessed superior industrial capacity. What they failed to grasp was how that capacity would translate into sustained technological advantages across multiple domains simultaneously. Germany could match American innovation in specific fields, jet propulsion, rocket technology, certain aspects of chemical engineering. But Germany couldn't match American innovation in electronics and aircraft production, and shipbuilding, and automotive manufacturing, and small arms, and artillery, and every other category of military equipment, all while maintaining civilian production that kept the home front supplied and morale stable. The proximity fuse exemplified this comprehensive advantage. American scientists had solved the theoretical problems. American engineers had developed practical production techniques. American factories had manufactured the devices by the millions. American logistics had distributed them globally. American training programs had taught soldiers how to employ them effectively. And American industrial capacity had sustained this entire chain, while simultaneously supporting dozens of other weapons programs, maintaining massive overseas supply lines, and building the atomic weapons that would end the war in the Pacific theater. German attempts to develop countermeasures to proximity fuses followed patterns established with other Allied technologies. Identify the threat, design a response, discover that producing the response at meaningful scale exceeded available resources, then watch the war end before limited production runs could affect the strategic situation. Engineers at Telefunken and Rheinmetall-Borsig developed radar warning receivers designated Fuchs that could theoretically detect the radio emissions from proximity fuses and provide warning to ground forces or aircraft. Several hundred units were manufactured for testing. Some entered limited field trials in early 1945. None achieved widespread deployment before Germany's surrender. The same pattern repeated with acoustic proximity fuses designated Kranich, electrostatic fuses designated Kuglock, and radio fuses designated Fuchs and Marder. All demonstrated functional prototypes. All faced production challenges related to component shortages, manufacturing disruptions, and resource allocation conflicts with other priority programs. All arrived too late to influence combat outcomes. The German technical community had the knowledge and expertise to develop sophisticated weapons. What Germany lacked was the industrial infrastructure to transform prototypes into deployed systems in quantities sufficient to change battlefield realities. General Major Osenberg's analysis, refined through February and March 1945 as Germany's military situation deteriorated, emphasized this distinction. In memoranda circulated among the shrinking circle of German technical leadership still attempting to coordinate research and development, Osenberg argued that Germany's fundamental error had been pursuing technological excellence through centralized direction rather than accepting incremental improvements produced by mass production techniques. The proximity fuse succeeded not because American scientists were more brilliant than their German counterparts. German researchers had explored similar concepts years earlier. It succeeded because American industry could manufacture millions of units, allow quality control processes to identify and correct problems, distribute the weapons widely enough for combat testing to provide feedback, and continuously refine production techniques to reduce costs and improve reliability. This iterative approach required enormous industrial capacity, but produced weapons that actually worked in battlefield conditions rather than laboratory tests. German rocket scientists could design ballistic missiles that traveled 300 kilometers and reached the edge of space. German jet engine designers could create aircraft that flew faster than any Allied fighters. German chemists could synthesize materials that didn't exist in nature. But German industry couldn't manufacture proximity fuses that survived artillery fire, produce miniature vacuum tubes that functioned after 20,000 G acceleration, or coordinate supply chains that delivered billions of precision components to assembly facilities operating continuously across multiple continents. These capabilities required different forms of expertise, industrial engineering, quality management, logistics coordination, where American advantages were overwhelming. The interrogations of German technical personnel during the final months of the war and immediate post-war period provided additional confirmation of these assessments. Operation Paperclip, the Allied program to recruit German scientists and engineers for work in the United States, processed thousands of specialists through screening and interview procedures. The interrogation reports from scientists involved in proximity fuse research revealed a consistent understanding that Germany had lost the industrial war long before losing the military war. Dr. Hans Rukop, Telefunken's chief engineer, described during his interrogation in June 1945 how German electronics manufacturers had discussed proximity fuse concepts throughout the 1930s. The technical principles were well understood. The manufacturing challenges appeared insurmountable, given available tube technology and production methods. When development resumed in 1944, advances in miniaturization techniques allowed functional prototypes. But by then, Germany's industrial base had deteriorated to the point that series production wasn't feasible. Rukop noted with evident bitterness that if Germany had maintained its 1939 industrial capacity through the war years, proximity fuses would probably have entered German service by 1943 or 1944. Instead, strategic bombing and resource shortages meant that Germany in 1945 possessed less manufacturing capability than it had commanded in 1939, while facing enemies whose production had increased by factors of 10 or more. Other specialists provided similar accounts. Engineers from Rheinmetall-Borsig explained how their Kuchglocker electrostatic fuse had achieved 95% reliability in testing, with 10 to 15 meter sensitivity performance, comparable to early American proximity fuses. Production facilities had been prepared, worker training had begun. Then Allied bombing destroyed key supply chain nodes. Cobalt shortages eliminated the permanent magnets required for certain components, and finally advancing American forces overran the Mühlhausen facilities before series production commenced. Several hundred test units existed. Approximately 1,000 rounds had been fired during development. All of this engineering effort produced exactly 0 combat-deployed weapons, because completing the final steps from successful prototype to mass-produced munition required industrial resources Germany no longer possessed. The post-war analysis by American technical intelligence teams confirmed that Germany had developed proximity fuse technology that worked. The Germans weren't years behind, theoretically. They were years behind, industrially unable to manufacture at scale, unable to maintain production under strategic bombing, unable to source materials in quantities required for sustained output. This distinction mattered profoundly for understanding how Germany lost the war. It wasn't that German science failed, or German engineers lacked competence. It was that industrial warfare at mid-20th century scales demanded resources that only nations with enormous manufacturing bases and access to global raw materials could sustain. The final reckoning came in the shattered remains of the Third Reich during April and May 1945. German forces had been pushed back into an ever-shrinking perimeter around Berlin. Industrial production had essentially ceased. Supply lines had collapsed. Ammunition shortages meant that artillery batteries often lacked shells, making the sophistication of fuse technology irrelevant when there was nothing to fire. The Wehrmacht was reduced to improvised weapons, child soldiers, and elderly men conscripted into Volkssturm units that lacked basic equipment. In this context, the discovery that American proximity fuses represented a technological achievement Germany couldn't match became almost irrelevant. By spring 1945, Germany's defeat stemmed not from any single technological disadvantage, but from comprehensive material exhaustion. The examination of the proximity fuse in January had been an exercise in understanding how completely Germany had been outproduced, out-engineered, and overwhelmed by opponents whose industrial capacity made continued resistance futile. General Dwight Eisenhower, writing after the war in his memoir Crusade in Europe, acknowledged the contribution of the proximity fuse in stark terms. He suggested that if Germany had succeeded in perfecting and deploying proximity fuses 6 months earlier than the Allies, the invasion of Europe might have proven exceedingly difficult, perhaps impossible. German anti-aircraft defences equipped with proximity fuses could have made the D-Day air operations unsustainable. German artillery using proximity fuses during the Normandy campaign could have inflicted casualties that halted the Allied advance. This counterfactual underscored the technology's strategic significance, but it also highlighted the fundamental asymmetry of the war. Germany would have needed to perfect proximity fuses not 6 months earlier than the Allies, but years earlier, and would have needed the industrial capacity to produce them by the millions, while simultaneously maintaining production of tanks, aircraft, ammunition, and all other military equipment. This was impossible given Germany's resource base and the Allied strategic bombing campaign that systematically degraded German manufacturing capacity from 1943 onward. The German officers and scientists who had examined the American proximity fuse in that cold Berlin laboratory during January 1945 understood this reality with painful clarity. They had held in their hands a device that represented everything Germany lacked: advanced miniaturization, reliable mass production, quality control that ensured consistent performance, and above all, an industrial system that could produce sophisticated technology by the millions without compromising other essential production. The fuse was a single example of comprehensive technological industrial superiority that extended across every domain of warfare. For Wehrmacht soldiers experiencing proximity-fused artillery fire in combat, the understanding was more immediate and visceral. They died in foxholes that should have provided protection. They watched comrades torn apart by shrapnel that rained from above with mechanical precision. They understood that the enemy possessed weapons against which traditional defensive tactics offered no sanctuary. The psychological impact of this helplessness contributed to the rapid collapse of German resistance during the final months of the war. Allied intelligence reports noted that German prisoners captured in March and April 1945 increasingly cited proximity-fused artillery as a primary factor in their decision to surrender. Not the fear of death itself, which soldiers accepted as an inevitable risk, but the specific fear of proximity-fused artillery that provided no chance of survival and no way to fight back. This was psychological warfare at its most effective, accomplished not through propaganda but through demonstrated futility of resistance. The statistical summary of proximity fuse effectiveness confirmed its battlefield impact. During the Battle of the Bulge and subsequent operations in early 1945, American artillery fired approximately 200,000 proximity-fused shells. The casualty rates inflicted on German forces exceeded conventional ammunition by factors of 3 to 5. General George Patton's assessment that the fuse required a complete revision of land warfare tactics proved accurate. Defensive positions that had been viable became death traps. Troop concentrations that traditional artillery might suppress became targets for systematic destruction. The lethality increase was so dramatic that it affected operational planning. American commanders undertook maneuvers that would have been too risky with conventional artillery because proximity fuses provided fire support that was qualitatively different and quantitatively overwhelming. The broader lesson extended far beyond any specific weapon system. The proximity fuse demonstrated that modern industrial warfare rewarded nations that could marshal comprehensive resources, scientific talent, engineering expertise, manufacturing capacity, raw materials, trained labor, and logistical sophistication toward weapons development and production. Germany had excelled in some of these domains. The United States excelled in all of them simultaneously. That comprehensive advantage proved decisive. The post-war migration of German scientists and engineers to the United States through Operation Paperclip created an ironic coda to the proximity fuse story. Many of the specialists who had examined captured American fuses in Berlin during January 1945 found themselves working for American defense contractors and government laboratories. By 1946 and 1947, they brought expertise in rocket technology, jet propulsion, and other advanced fields where German research had achieved remarkable results. But they also brought an understanding, born from direct experience, of how industrial capacity and organizational efficiency could transform theoretical knowledge into deployed systems. Dr. Wernher von Braun, who had directed Germany's V-2 rocket program, became one of the most prominent German scientists recruited by the United States. During his interrogations and early work in America, he repeatedly emphasized that Germany's defeat stemmed not from lack of innovation, but from inability to sustain production while fighting a multi-front war against opponents with superior resources. The V-2, impressive as a technical achievement, had consumed enormous resources for minimal strategic effect. Meanwhile, American proximity fuses, conceptually simpler, had multiplied the effectiveness of existing weapon systems and been produced in quantities that ensured every artillery, battery, and naval vessel received adequate supplies. This distinction between impressive innovation and effective implementation influenced post-war American defense development. The United States military, studying lessons from World War II, concluded that technological sophistication should serve operational requirements rather than exist for its own sake. Weapons should be designed for mass production from the start. Quality control should be embedded throughout development rather than addressed after production began. And industrial capacity to sustain output under combat conditions mattered more than achieving marginal performance advantages through designs that were difficult to manufacture. The proximity fuse exemplified these principles. It wasn't the most sophisticated weapon of World War II. That distinction probably belonged to the atomic bomb. It wasn't the most revolutionary radar, and other technologies had more far-reaching implications for post-war development, but it was the most effective marriage of technological innovation and industrial production. It worked reliably under battlefield conditions. It could be manufactured by the millions. It multiplied the effectiveness of existing weapons. And it demonstrated to enemies that they faced an opponent with resources that couldn't be matched through tactical excellence or operational innovation alone. For the Wehrmacht generals who had examined the device in January 1945, these lessons came too late to influence Germany's fate. The war would end 4 months later with Germany's unconditional surrender, its cities in ruins, its industrial base destroyed, its military comprehensively defeated. But the knowledge remained the understanding that they had fought enemies whose technological and industrial advantages were so comprehensive that German resistance had been futile from the moment America entered the war and began applying its full productive capacity toward military purposes. The proximity fuse stood as testament to what free societies could achieve when they combined scientific excellence with industrial might and unwavering determination. It proved that the greatest victories came not from seeking the impossible, but from making the necessary possible through systematic application of resources, methodical engineering, and the acceptance that war at industrial scales demanded capabilities that only nations with massive manufacturing bases could sustain. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.